nothing new in the world of sales except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, best-selling author of The Transparency Sale and The Transparent Sales Leader, keynote speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
Everybody always wants to know about prospecting, so today, let's get into it. I've done episodes on the subject before. Specifically, there's an earlier episode where I shared the first telephone cold calling scripts I've been able to dig up from the 1910s, both B2C, so business to consumer, and B2B, business to business. So go check those out. But today, I want to share some advice on my favorite little finds and the answer to some questions about prospecting advice. The world of LinkedIn, even YouTube and TikTok, your local bookstore, well, just about everywhere, is flush with it. On a recent Sunday, while cool people were doing cool things, my kids were playing video games, my wife was sitting on the couch reading, and I, on the other hand, wanted to figure out where all this prospecting advice came from. I mean, there aren't really any new ideas, just new takes on old ideas, right? So I grabbed a pile of books from my collection that encompass the gamut of sales process steps and reread the prospecting chapters on a stack of them, all dated between 50 and 120 years ago. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to answer a few questions. So number one, while the concept of prospecting has been around forever, I wanted to know where that word prospecting first showed up. We'll talk about that, and we'll go back to 1910 for that one. Number two was, when doing our prospecting, was the original thinking just numbers and metrics, or was it research and service? We'll look to the 1920s here. Number three will be, I once had a sales training franchise back in 2003 and 2004. Now, I ran it in the ground, don't get me wrong, but I taught cold calling techniques, really old school stuff, things that I would be embarrassed to teach today, but the focus was always about knowing your numbers. I found the origin of that concept. We'll go to the 1940s for this one. Number four is the role of telephone in selling, using the telephone. We're going to look at Ford Motor Company's sales book called Selling Sense from 1954 for that interesting rant. And then we're going to wrap up by going back to here's some interesting data, the number of touches research. You know what I'm talking about, the data that you hear today that says it takes 18 touches to connect with today's executive. That stat drives me nuts, by the way, but I found similar data from 1969 on that. And oh, by the way, I may sneak in a couple of random old prospecting ideas along the way. You ready? Well, let's start with that first one. What I found to be an interesting trivia answer for you around the question, when did the word prospecting become associated with selling and why? Prior to 1910, prospecting wasn't called prospecting. It had been traditionally referred to as canvassing or cold canvassing or even cold turkey canvassing. Norval Hawkins, in his 1910 book, Certain Success, is the first I found to start calling it prospecting. Now, I'm not saying that this is the definite start of that word. Don't get me wrong, but I hadn't seen it, and I looked. When did he call it prospecting? Well, in comparison to mining for gold. He said, quote, "The master salesman thinks of prospecting as the gold miner uses the word to describe his activities when he searches for valuable mineral deposits. Miners prospecting for gold need a, quote, thrilling zest for discovery, unflagging energy, and that, quote, you be fired by the ardor for the quest." He went on to say that miners don't just randomly hack around. They're constantly keeping their eyes and ears open, quote, for indications of opportunities to success and be, quote, ready in advance to take instant advantage of any you may discover. And just as often, while the clues are there, the miner will come up empty. Hawkins goes on to say, quote, "It has been estimated that the busy bee inserts his proboscis into flowers 3.6 million times to obtain a single pound of honey. but the bee is the only insect, remember, that lives on honey. He then compares it to salesmanship and says, quote, prospecting supplies the food of salesmanship, and without it, he grows thin and weak to the point of failure. There you have it. So that's number one, prospecting, a word derived from its use in gold mining from around 1910. Okay, let's move forward 11 years and talk about the second data point to discuss today, namely, should we research first or should we just go bang down some doors? Well, in 1921, Harry Dexter Kickson wrote the book, The Mind of the Buyer, A Psychology of Selling. All right, the mind of the buyer. So let's talk about the way that buyers think. Let's talk psychology. Now, the book cover for this one cracks me up. It has an individual pushing a cart full of ice. And then in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of an Inuit, which is the current term for what is known as an Eskimo. It represents the old phrase, he could sell ice cubes to Eskimos, right? I just thought that was funny. But when we talk about the core idea of knowing your customers, I mean, the title of the book is The Mind of the Buyer. But here's the quote that stands out. Quote, the salesman should delineate the problem of the buyer with exceeding sharpness. To do this, he must study the buyer's needs beforehand. Someone has remarked that a successful salesman must know more about the buyer's business than the buyer does himself. Again, core teachings from over 100 years ago. Your role is to be an advisor to the client. And to do that, you need to be an expert. The customer is living in their own work-life bubble. You're bringing the expertise of not only your solutions, but the challenges of the hundreds of other customers you've talked to and work with. So that one is number two. Now, popping forward about 20 years to 1940, let's look at the book Salesmanship by Bertrand R. Canfield. He says something that I thought was funny, which is, quote, successful prospecting involves the use of not one, but several methods. Good prospecting demands diversification of method. Right there, that's a quote. Diversification of method. Don't just hammer one channel. That's from 1940. So that's a good one. But moving along to that third question about numbers and metrics, Canfield explains it in a way that takes me back. When I first tried to run my own business back in 2003, as I mentioned, I bought a sales training franchise teaching cold calling techniques. It's the same almost exactly as what was written in the franchise manuals of what I taught. First, Canfield shares the concept of having a, quote, quota of prospects. He goes on to say that, quote, a salesman will be more successful in obtaining a sufficient number of prospects if he establishes a daily, weekly, or monthly quota of prospects. He then introduces us to the idea of how to determine what that quota should be for yourself. And this is the part that matches what I was teaching in the early 2000s. Quote, by determining the ratio of prospects secured to the number of units or dollar volume sold, a salesman can quickly establish the number of prospects which he must obtain to sell a certain volume. Then, by multiplying his total sales expectancy in dollars or units by his prospect ratio, he can quickly determine his prospect quota. He goes on to share a little bit of math by saying if a salesman averages 10 prospects to a sale, and he desires to make 5 sales a month, he must secure a total of 50 prospects a month to obtain his sales quota. 10 new prospects must be secured for every prospect converted to a customer. Now, while he was all about the numbers, he also talked about, like in that 1920 book, the need and the preaching of preparation. Quote, successful salesmanship is 90% preparation and 10% presentation. Before a lawyer faces a jury, he spends many hours preparing his case, reading, accumulating evidence, and interviewing witnesses. Like a good lawyer, a successful salesman prepares his arguments in advance of his interviews. He acquaints himself with the needs of his prospect. He assembles ideas, illustrations, and facts to meet these needs and arranges them in the most effective order. He anticipates possible objections and has answers ready. Now, Canfield's got a little framework of the 4 things you should be ready with as a salesperson at all times when you're prospecting. Here's Canfield's list. Number 1 is to have an opening. to get the attention and arouse the interest of a prospect in a specific need for the product or service. Number 2, he says, is a description of how the product meets the prospect's needs or solves his difficulties. Number 3 is proof or evidence of how the product has satisfied the needs of others through substantiated facts in the form of statistics, testimonials, references, tests, and guarantees. And number 4 is a conclusion that motivates a prospect to buy through special inducements. The other thing that I found interesting about Canfield's book is he just talks about this idea. He actually makes the claim that salespeople actually are only selling for about an hour and a half per day. Now, we've all seen posts that sound like this, but here was his math. He said, quote, in a year, a salesman has only 2,336 hours of working time, of which 350 hours are spent face-to-face with prospects, 467 hours waiting to see prospects, 935 hours traveling between prospects, and 584 hours in clerical work and planning. So this boils down to, as he says, that, quote, actual selling time is short, only about an hour and a half a day. So that hasn't changed much either, has it? Maybe a little less traveling, especially in this virtual world, but we still have so much else to do. So let's go on a little tangent here. I want to talk quickly about Elmer Wheeler's 1948 book called Tested Salesmanship. And he was really starting to talk about telephone prospecting specifically, but he made an interesting point that I just wanted to illuminate. Keep in mind, in the 1940s, telephone calls were considerably more expensive back then. He said, quote, you can buy lists, salesmen can telephone them, and a long-distance phone call by the reputable house is well in order since it shows personal interest and is most flattering to the one getting the call. I just thought that was interesting because we talk about this idea of give to get, but imagine you're sitting somewhere and you get a long-distance call, you're probably going to take it because it means that it must be important and that person meant to talk to you specifically versus today's phone dialers and all of that. So you were going to get connected, which is an amazing little thought. Wheeler also added a piece about honesty and integrity, so of course I'm going to add that in. He said, for those selling intangibles, things you cannot, quote, often see, hear, touch, or feel, like those selling insurance or investments or anything that you don't actually touch, he says you seldom can see what he has for sale, so honesty and integrity are his best assets in developing a prospect list. Let's go to 1954. There's a book that was written by Ford called Selling Sense, but it was actually written by a guy named Thomas Burns. But he said something that I also thought was interesting. He said this thought, quote, the guy named Bell invents the telephone. At last, what a blessing for the salesman. All you have to do is look up a name, quick as a wink, dial the number, and speak. Wonderful. No wasted time. The whole thing only took 43 seconds. But then he goes on to say, the telephone is okay. Telephone means you can reach more people in less time. You can tell who's worth going after and who isn't. It saves you long rides into the country or around several blocks. The telephone is only a tool. A tool's effectiveness depends on its user. You can't expect to sit at the telephone all day and make your sales objective. The telephone does not take the place of direct mail, personal calls, or demonstrations. It's merely a time saver, a handy way to reach more prospects quickly and interesting them to the point where they're willing to let you come out and talk to them and perhaps take them on a test drive. Know whom to call, know when to call, know what to say and how to say it. Get to the point quickly but pleasantly. Be brief but not abrupt. Don't yakety yak. Don't impose on the prospect's time, and don't waste your own. He has nothing but your voice to go by. Be human, warm, friendly. So I love that one. That was a really, really good one. All right, let's go on to number 5 here. And number 5 is about the data points. And I just had to share this because I think it's so fascinating. You often hear the data points about how many touches it takes to get a hold of an executive and how many interactions you need to have and how we need to multi-thread and talk to multiple people and continue to reach out. Well, it's funny that in 1969, so over 50 years ago, in the book Creative Salesmanship by Haas and Ernest, again, 1969, here was a data point. They wrote, Quote, a recent survey reveals that 80% of all sales are made after the 5th call. It also reveals that 48% of salespeople calling on unsold prospects make 1 call and quit. 25% make 2 calls and quit. 10% keep calling and make 80% of the sales. These figures indicate the value of systematic, methodological, purposeful, and patient follow-up of prospects. The salesman with empathy has the ability to put himself in the position of others and to see things the way they do. Empathy is not charm or exuberance, nor is sympathy or pity. So, last but not least, number 5, we talked a little bit about data and those metrics and how many touches it takes. I thought that one was amazing. Again, 1969, they're saying a recent survey reveals that 80% of all sales are made after the 5th call and that most people quit after 1. All right. You might be asking, but Todd, what does the GOAT himself, Arthur Sheldon, have to say about prospecting? Well, I'm glad you asked. In 1917, in his book, The Science of Business, he laid this quote on us. Quote, other things being equal, the power of the individual to find or to get into communication with those to whom he can be useful varies directly with the excellence of the motive by which he is actuated. How true, how true. And those last few words should serve as a guiding light for all we do in the sales profession. Quote, the excellence of the motive by which we are actuated. The fundamentals of our great profession have been established and repeated for generations. Every subject, including discovery, qualification, presenting, negotiating, even transparency, can be found in all of these old texts. I post about them daily, by the way, at Sales Historian on Instagram and X. But as always, if you'd like to have me dig into something specific you want me to look up, please reach out. I so appreciate you listening. Please review it. Please share it if you like it. I love that. And as always, appreciate you spending your time with me on the Sales History Podcast today. And until next time, thanks again.